welcome back. We are now in take 2. And in Monty Python terms, for something completely different. So we started off with the eldest sector in finance, the banking. And now we are going to one of the newest, carbon credit markets. So 2 fascinating papers. But also, I expect in the debate also everybody has an opinion on these carbon credits. But in the end, as Beatrice told me yesterday, we also need them because we cannot decarbonize everything. So we need to work on solutions, but are they reliable? So that is a big question. And so I'm really excited that we are going to look at market design. That is one an old-fashioned thing in stock markets, market microstructure, extremely important. And also on the second paper, what is working, what is not working. So something completely different, but I'm looking forward. So the first paper is on market design. Estelle Cantillon from University Libre de Brussels, the hometown of ECGI. So Estelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dirk. Okay, so this is actually a paper that we wrote for a book on advances in market design that's going to be published by the NBR, hopefully next year. So this is really about market design for the environment more general. I'm going to focus also obviously on carbon. But what's important to say here at the outset is that and I think it's just echoing what Dirk just said. We will need markets for sure, because we are encroaching more and more on nature. And at some point, and there's a question about how do we do this? You know, the question of efficiency, effectiveness is coming to the fore. Okay, so. What are we talking about? So we go talking about nature in general, and nature is providing a lot of services. They're about provisioning services, food and wood and so forth, but also regulating services and that support our lives, you know, the photosynthesis, soil formation, and so on. The problem, of course, is that all of these services are subject to externalities, okay? And so I think here, this is a review paper, so it's trying to organize our thoughts about this, and it's useful to separate them into problems where the issue is that they are weak property rights or common property rights. I'm going to call them common pool resources. They're non-excludable, subject to congestion. And on the other hand, problems where actually property rights are not the issue. There are well-established property rights on these natural resources, but these natural resources are creating a positive externalities on others that don't have control rights. And so then you have the issue that maybe it's going to be under-provided. Okay, so then once you go one step below, in the common pool resources category, the issue here is that they might, the resource, if they are weak property rights, the resource is going to be overexploited. Think about fisheries, water resources, okay? Or if you think about pollution, then there's going to be excess degradation. You know, you think about pollutants at different scales, nitrogen, oxides, SO2, CO2 is one of those, okay? In both of these cases, you have, the problem is that you have weak or common property rights on the natural resource or on the quality of the environment. On the right-hand side, the issue here is that so you have well-established property rights, but the issue is that it's going to be under-provided. Think about biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and all of these ecosystems services. Okay. And so here, what are the roles of markets, and what kind of markets do we have? So typically, the legacy ownership in the overexploitation degradation problem is that you have shared or non-existent property rights, otherwise it's private. The policy objective in all of these cases, here in the first case, is to ensure sustainable exploitation of the natural resource. In the case of degradation, is to limit the pollution. In the case of the under-provision, is to encourage provision beyond what the private owner would do. Okay, and you can see, you know, the role of markets, type of markets, and the type of governance. I'm going to focus in the rest of the talk to the last 2 columns, so the problems of excess degradation or under-provision of natural resources. In the case of degradation, you typically have public compliance markets. Okay, so this is about the ETS, the emission trading scheme, is there in the last column when it's about trying to encourage private owners of natural resources to increase the provision of natural resources. Typically, we have both public and private markets. Okay, so that's for the big picture. There's going to be a key message on this, is that when you talk about nature, it's important to really pay close attention to the underlying biophysical process behind this. Okay, CO2 is different from sulfur dioxide, from nitrogen oxide, and all of these things. It's really important to understand that. Plus the nature of the market. Are we talking about a pollution market? Are we talking about provision markets? You'd see that it makes a big difference in terms of the first order design parameters. What is the thing we should really pay close attention to? And what are the kind of solutions we're talking to? Okay, I'm going to illustrate these. So right now, this may look a little bit abstract. I'm going to illustrate these points with carbon compliance markets, so the emission trading scheme on the one hand, and voluntary carbon markets. So carbon emission mitigation, it's important to understand the difference between pollution markets and provision markets. Pollution markets are markets that are set up to somehow reduce the amount of pollutions that regulated entities emit. Provision markets, and here I'm thinking about carbon sinks in the application, it's just encourage the provision of these things. And here it's important in terms of, so the left-hand side, this is about, trajectories under, the Paris Agreement. On the right-hand side, I think it's interesting to know that nature-based solutions could contribute 37% of cost-effective emissions reductions towards the Paris Agreement goal, and land use and forests represent around 25% of the planned nationally determined contributions today. So this is really important to get it right. I think just go back to what Dirk said. Here's another, few things where you see that now the way you organize things, whether you organize this as a pollution market or provision markets, highlight or emphasize different aspects in the design that will be important. So in the pollution market, there's going to be essentially a compliance motive. In the provision market, we are more in a mostly voluntary motive. Pollution market, typically public governance. These are regulated markets. Provision markets, mostly private or hybrid mechanism. In a pollution market, we really know what is the polluting entity. And whereas in the provision market, it's a global market, anyone can join, so there's all going to be question about who joins. That's back to the participation aspect. In the pollution market, the property rights is very clear. It's a permit to emit 1 ton of greenhouse gas in the case of the ETS, for example. In the provision markets, the property right is a claim to avoid or remove 1 ton of greenhouse gas. And that's where, again, the biophysical aspect matters. So carbon, as you know, is a stock pollutant, and it's a global pollutant. Doesn't matter where it's emitted, it has the same impact on climate. So it's going to be the issue is going to be about the boundary problem. So the way that's going to be a first order design parameter for pollution markets, that pollution markets deal in several ways. They will be linking between different emission trading schemes. Free allocations is another way to deal with the boundary problem. So you give free allocations to some of the regulated firms so that they don't move their operations outside of the jurisdiction. Or the CBAM, of course, is another way to deal with the boundary problem. Okay. In the provision market, the issue is that the concern, again, because it's CO2, you care about, it's a global pollutant. You care about that the person who said they reduce their emissions are not being compensated by someone else increasing emissions elsewhere. So you are avoiding deforestation on one piece of land, but suddenly now another piece next door is being deforested. Okay, that's a boundary problem, and typically it's dealt with the crediting methodology of the scheme. Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through first the emission trading scheme in Europe as an application. I'm going to be a little bit fast, but you'll see that there are lessons about the design from the emission trading scheme in Europe for the voluntary carbon markets. And then next I'm going to move to the voluntary carbon market. Many design parameters. It's about what is the market scope? What are the sectors we cover? Which companies do we make all companies that emit into the system, only some above a certain threshold, with the jurisdiction, the time, can you bank or borrow allowances? What is the cap level? How do we allocate the allowances? Do we give them for free? And if so, how? Do we auction them? What are the compliance cycles? How do we organize the market? Who can trade? Where? What are the limits of trading? All of the ETS around the world have taken different decisions on this. Why? Because there's a bunch of arbitrage. Okay, and so they're taking a different stance on these arbitrage. But the big, the main purpose of these markets here is always about cost efficiency. Can we reduce the emissions or the pollution at the least cost? That's really the reason why we're designing these markets. And for that, you need, and that's really central, you need informative and stable price signals so that it provides an incentives for the regulated companies to make the necessary abatement investment. If you don't have a informative and stable price signal, it defeats the purpose. And then there's a bunch of other considerations. So this is a slide that summarizes the choices that were taken in the European Union about these different parameters across the 4 different phases that we've had. Phase 1 started in 2005, and we are now in phase 5. I'm going to walk you through quickly. I want to highlight a few things that will be useful when I talk about voluntary carbon market. So the first thing I want to mention is that the scope of these markets, has increased over time. In terms of the countries that are including in the emission trading schemes, but most importantly, the sectors and the gases. And the reason here is about that you see that there's been an improvement in the technologies and in our ability to measure emissions in some ways. And so that's increased the confidence of regulators to say, okay, we can now include these sectors or these gases into the market. So that's the role of technology. The role of technology is positive here. Second thing is about how do you deal with a cap? But here I'm going to skip this. How do you keep with the boundary? So the boundary problem. So initially, most of the allowances were grandfathered. So we looked at past historical emissions, and we gave you free allowances commensurate to your past emissions. Since phase 3, the default allocation is an auction. But there's also, just to deal with the boundary problem, to ensure that the firms that are subject to international competition stay in Europe and don't move their emissions away. There are still some free allowances, but they're given based on a benchmarking. There are some issues with how these benchmarking are designed, but I'm not going to get into this. And as you know, the CBAM is entering into force. So now, instead of saying that we are ensuring that the domestic firms in Europe are competing domestically in the EU on the same. So when you do free allocation, you're making sure that the European firms are competing on the same footing as all of the other firms worldwide. With the CBAM, we'll just make sure that they're competing on the same footing internally in Europe. Okay, because what this means is that Indian firms or Chinese firms will have to pay allowances to sell in the EU, okay? And the last thing is about the governance, and governance is going to be really important when we talk about the voluntary carbon market. You need to realize that in 2005, the EU took a very laissez-faire approach to markets. I have a quote from the European Commission that basically said, we are defining property rights and the rest will be taken care of the market like apple and oranges, okay? Countries, all of the registries for measuring these allowances were at the national level. The market, even across the different countries, in some countries, allowances were considered a financial instrument. In some others, they were considered as a commodity subject to VAT. This created the VAT fraud carousel that you may have heard about. This was hacking of these registries because probably some of the countries were not as well equipped. But since phase 3, this market now is regulated under MiFID. Okay, and this is where this has been, it's been a little bit some order has been put into this market. But it's interesting to learn from these mistakes. What drives the price in the emission trading scheme? So if you think about the market fundamentals, it should be about what is the cost of abating emissions. So that's the technology side. It also should be on the demand side for these emissions, the business as usual emissions, the economic activity, other overlapping policies that may be reducing emissions elsewhere, and of course the cap and the timing of allocations and constraints. Okay. And so if you focus only on these economic fundamentals, what you see, if you do it theoretically, you see that the price should follow what's called a martingale, should have a martingale property. So the prices should be fairly stable, and whenever there's a shock, either a shock to a technology, a shock to demand, the price is adjusting, but it's adjusting just a little bit because somehow it's just changing the future path, because you need to ensure that the marginal cost of abatement, the expected marginal cost of abatement across time increases. And again, it's important to drive long-term investment. The problem, of course, is that this is not what we're seeing in terms of stable prices. This is the graph of EU ETS prices since 2005, and you see that it's been going up, but it's been highly volatile. It's actually more volatile than some of the commodity markets like oil and copper and so on, which has no reason for this because there's very little frictions in terms of intertemporal arbitrage for allowances. There's no storage cost, right? If you buy copper and you want to arbitrage, of course you need to somehow store it somewhere. You don't have that. This is just for the past year. The price has gone from 90 euros to at some point 55. This is what this was taken. So that's really one remaining issue for this market, is the volatility of prices. There's a bunch of reasons, and I've put them on this slide, that have been put forward for why this is the case. There are a bunch of market design questions of how we should be supporting long-term markets for hedging. So today, allowances, you can only buy them 2 years forward, for example. If all of the investment we're talking about are 25, 30, 50 years long, right? So it's really hard. It's about also who should participate. In some countries, like in China, it's only the regulated entities that trade. In the ETS, it's just a wide open. It's for everyone, and everyone uses it for different purposes. Okay, so that's a bunch of design questions that's come forward. But let me just stop here because I'd like to talk now about provision markets. I'm sure you recognize John Oliver. You may have seen this number was probably 2 years ago, maybe a year. What is it? No, he's not a fan. Let me just say a few words about voluntary carbon markets. So you have on one side a project that reduces carbon emissions relative to business as usual or removes carbon. And on the other side, you have an individual company that's eager to compensate their emissions. And, we certify the project and there's money being transferred. So it's really important for characteristics or for properties that we look into these markets is it additional? So without the money, would it have happened? Is it permanent, the carbon reduction? Are we measuring it properly? So are we avoiding to overcredit the benefit of this? Is it traceable? Can we be sure that the project owner doesn't sell twice their benefit, for example, okay? And there's an entire ecosystem of standard setters, third-party certifiers, registries, and market platforms and intermediaries, okay? That's, in short, and I'm hoping that Zachery was going to cover this a little bit more into details. there's huge potential, but the market has been plagued, if you follow this market, by low trust and a lot of scandals. As a result, prices have plummeted, and here I want you to focus on the price of nature-based carbon, which used to be around $15 per ton at the end of this 2021, and now is basically around 1 or 2 euros. That's for nature-based provision markets. Okay. So, and this is going to be an important slide. There are recent developments in these markets trying to fix it, and I think it's really important to think about how to fix it. There have been technological advances, satellite images, blockchain, and so on, that's going to help, improve the monitoring, improve baseline accuracy, improve traceability. This is all really good and needed. Another way the market has been trying to solve its problem is by restricting both the supply and the demand. Restricting the supply by raising the standards for being credited. Restricting demand is by saying you can only use these credits under such and such circumstances. And there are legislative initiatives on these things in different jurisdictions. But of course, the demand will not go away. What I'd like to focus on is on the right-hand side. None of this is going to be enough. That's my argument. The first thing is that we're not clear about the primary objective of this market. Is it really about project finance in jurisdictions without a carbon price? Is it payment for ecosystem services? Is it access to cost-effective abatement options? So in other words, is this it's an alternative to mitigation? There's a big I think in terms of asset design, there's really something to be done. I mean, your contract here is that Patrick should be solving this thing. Some ways the impermanence of the carbon reduction calls for something more like a derivative, to design it more as a derivative rather than an asset as it is right now, I think. And the last point I'd like to emphasize is that we also need proper market governance. And there are really important lessons from the ETS. Today, this as a voluntary market, this is not going to work in my view. And one last point, if I may. A big area of discussion is whether we should use carbon credits or we should integrate compliance markets and voluntary carbon markets and allow firms that are regulated under an emission trading scheme to use carbon credits to claim for this, like the CDMs before, okay? I think we need to be super, super careful. Even if we fix the integrity problems that we haven't fixed, we need to be, and the reason is, all of the integrity issues, I'm hoping that Zachery will talk about them. I think there's one point that we're bringing in this paper that was not made, that we haven't seen made so much elsewhere, is the fact that we need to make sure that both things happen. So this is a summary. This is from the IPCC that shows that how do we need to decarbonize? We essentially need to reduce emissions. That's the mitigation part that's dealt with pollution markets. And you have also nature-based contributions here. It's not or, it's and. Okay? Once you allow a carbon credit from nature-based carbon credit to be counted here, you basically do double counting. Okay? Period. And so that's why it's really interesting to see that in Europe, the current projects are opening the door for using voluntary carbon credits to be included in the emission trading scheme, but they do say that it's industrial carbon removals. They don't open the door for nature-based carbon credits. In the UK, they have a consolidation note that leaves that door open for nature-based, and I think it should be clear. To me, this should be a no-no. So it's still an open area for research. That's really what I'd like to do. Conclusions, but there's still a lot of fundamental questions that we don't know about it, so there's still more research needed. I think there's 3 insights from what we did in this paper. One is that the design must be tailored to the underlying biophysical process, very important. Fishery markets are not the same thing as nutrient markets, so on. Examples, restrictions on borrowing for stock pollutants, asset design that accounts for non-permanence of carbon removals in nature-based provision markets. Second insight is the EU ETS and the voluntary carbon market each have their own issues that need to be fixed. Third insight is that pollution markets and provision markets are pursuing different objectives, and we, in the context of climate action, should not be integrated at this stage. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think it's really exciting to really look from a public policy perspective at these issues. And you raised quite a few issues. Anybody involved in impact investing, the holy grail is the GIN definition. And I know from practice, the key thing is their additionality. Is your investment making a difference? That's so difficult to prove, and you can lose yourself in measurement. And that's exactly the point you raised here. So additionality. I've been policymaker, and I really like that you talk about objectives. What are the objectives of the markets before we integrate them? Because before you make regulations, you need to know what you want to achieve. And if you're not clear on that, you cannot deliver. And the third one, I think the main message is governance. So in that sense, it is really for the European Corporate Governance Institute. And I think that's also evolution. You start the ETS national to get it going. And when you want to improve it, you centralize. That's what we always do with things. You get started, and without proper governance, and I think that's the biggest challenge for the carbon credits to get proper governance. And remember Ostrom. She got the first woman in economics to get the Nobel Prize. Her design principles for common pool resources, and which everybody forgets, is monitoring and enforcement. So like we have UNPRI and all other kinds, they don't kick out members. If you don't kick out members, if they don't keep up the promise, then you are not effective with private solutions. So monitoring and kicking out is needed if we want to keep private markets, and that's public policy. So now we go to the questions. Beatrice.
Thank you very much. This was an excellent overview and systematization. I was wondering, you had nature and biodiversity at some stages on your slides, and the problem there with the underlying biophysical processes is that there are both complementarities. There may be negative or positive interactions. So if you conserve forests, you're also conserving biodiversity, and this is something that you may want to be paying for separately. But you can, on the other hand, if you're only concerned with the tons, you can increase forest monocultures and cut biodiversity. I'm not sure that we have a full. Let me ask it this way. Do you think there should be 2 markets, one for biodiversity credits and one for carbon, or can they be joined as they are right now?
That's a good question. So you, Beatrice, you're putting your finger exactly on the difficulty of biodiversity, valuing biodiversity as natural resources. And indeed, it's a bundle of properties that you're trying to value. And I think at this stage, it's even less mature than the carbon markets and just thinking about even carbon. So probably we'll need to. And if you, maybe one thing you could say is that if you look at what's done on biodiversity, that would go for the payment for ecosystem services type of scheme that exists. They're much lower, smaller scale. And what you see is that in the contracts that they sign, the valuation part is a very small part of the whole scheme. And this, what this means to me is that the scope for market is probably very low, because you need a market. The only, in some ways, the benefit of market is scale, and so how you need to harmonize stuff. Even the voluntary carbon credits. You've seen that they trade at a different price, even though it's 1 ton of carbon every time. And so I think that the issue is like, how do you harmonize so that you get the benefit of scale? So, but payment for ecosystem services are a market-based approach to deal with this, but it might be better suited for the complexity of these of the nature service, I would think.
Here, two questions. First, Patrick, we collect 2 questions now.
If we had done, let's be careful, we would not have had phase 1, we would have not had phase 2, not phase 3, and not phase 4. Phase 1, phase 2 were experimentation phases. We screwed up, we messed up, we fixed it. That's how you progress, and that's how you can do it quickly. And I think that's the approach we need to take for integrating voluntary and mandatory carbon markets. Let's not try too hard to get everything right from the get-go. Let's try and integrate, see what we learn, and then improve as we get more information.
Mm-hmm. Let's also take the questions from Robert, and then we go back.
I think an interesting example of this is the California exchange, which does accept offsets, but they have I think they're only allowed to use 5% of your carbon budget is offsets. So just, where does 5% come from is a pretty complicated question, but it's actually the question you're asking. To what extent is a carbon offset really offsetting carbon? And it might be useful to think about that as a way of gradually integrating these markets. Putting money behind it helps.
Yeah. So I agree. I agree. I think we need to move forward. I think we need to focus on the no-regret moves. And so rather than having the question of should we integrate them now, the nature-based markets and the emission trading scheme, is just fix the voluntary carbon market and scale it up with proper governance. The European approach, by the way, of allowing engineered carbon, like industrial carbon removal, is one way to integrate offsets, but avoiding the double counting, because all of the questions you have are about fixing, making sure that even if it's not the market is not exactly, the additionality or the measurement is not proper, it still is commensurate, it's still leading to double counting. And so that's a conceptual issue where we need to avoid. We need a proper nature-based markets, and we need the proper mitigation markets. And industrial carbon removals is one way to include offsets that doesn't avoid this double counting. Yes, sorry.
2 final questions, one here and one there.
So picking up this point about the limits of market consolidation, it's that's the heart of it, right? Because we always say that the solution is tax the pollutants. The negative externality can be internalized by a high enough carbon price. But if you think about just the 3 that you've talked about there, the ETS, call it 70, 80 per ton of CO2 equivalent. The nature-based solutions, call it less than 5 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And the industrial removals, call it between 250 and 750 per ton of CO2 equivalent, if you're talking about negative emissions from BECCS or from DAC, respectively. How you consolidate those 3 markets, do you think we should try by dealing with the issues of substitution of every time you add offset into the compliance market, whether it's industrial or nature, discounting for permanence to get them to be actually fungible? Do you think we should try to consolidate, or should we just leave them to form their own price dynamics?
Thanks. There a question? Yes, please. That's the final question.
Yeah. Do you think these markets can get to a scale where state actors can participate in them? I have in mind the example of Gulf states taking over certain parts of African countries to presumably purchase carbon credits to use at some point in the future. Can these markets scale to accommodate that sort of action, and should they?
Okay, so on your question, so I think it's back to what Dirk said. I think it's important to remember what the objectives are. So provision markets, pollution markets, keep them separate in these tracks. And then, whether you want to include, I think BECS and so on, the industrial removal, it makes sense for me to introduce, integrate them into emission trading scheme. It could be that you need also investment incentives. So not only because in some ways these carbon markets are rewarding flows of carbon, but these are high capex activities, and somehow you may want to have a subsidy auction like for the the capex. It's about how you structure these things also that matters. And on the question of state actors, so so just to make sure I understood your question, so is it about that if we move to a public governance of this market, this will fix it, or?
So I see the markets at the moment we're working.
Yes.
Should they also be used to offset national level emissions?
Well, I mean, Article 6 this is all. This is what it is all about. Huh? I think there are big carbon sinks in the south. There's a need for financial flows to go from the north to the south, and so this might be one big medium if we fix it to do this, to achieve that. Yeah.
So let's conclude on the main message. As Patrick said, get going, what we know, instead of waiting too long. And I think the second message is, Estelle, we need to look at the underlying biophysical processes. I think that was Beatrice's question. We need to be very careful as economists, finance people, non-experts. So we need to reach out to these other disciplines to get it right. They know it. And we should integrate them also in this type of conferences, I think, to be interdisciplinary. So a big round of applause for Estelle. So now, what's already happening in practice? So we now go to Zachery Halem from Lazard Climate Center to see what's already happening and how things are going in the market. The floor is yours.
Thanks. So the good news is we'll be just continuing this conversation because a lot of what's going to be discussed is the practical implementation of mainly the voluntary market, and also zooming in pretty much on the latter half of what Estelle presented, focusing on substantial limitations, how we see them play out. This is a review paper, so we go through a number of examples of where there are failings and additionality, double counting, and then finally moving towards how we can move towards a more robust market, fix that, and also policy implementations, the interface between regulated and voluntary markets, and how the voluntary market may actually dictate future policy. So just starting off very high level, what is an offset? How did it originate? So the first case of an offset came in the Clean Air Act, and the more structured approach first originated in the CDM, which I'll use kind of as a baseline to discuss how the voluntary market evolved. The CDM coming out of the Kyoto Protocol, which allowed developing countries to essentially perform project finance for carbon-based projects in the developing world. As we'll see there, it tended to focus quite a bit on industrial gas, less on nature-based. And really, what is an offset? I think this is going to be the fundamental question that I ask, and how should it be structured as a financial instrument. But broadly speaking, an offset, it's a purchasable asset used to finance reducing or sequestering projects. And who buys offsets in the voluntary scheme? It's mainly corporates. Why do they do that? It's on the most part to facilitate net zero commitments. Actually, the first instance of this came, it was incentivized by Clinton, at least in the US, who advised companies that they should be taking action now rather than waiting till later. So there's nothing really mandating it in the voluntary sense. That's why it's a voluntary market. The typical trajectory, you have a project identification and development. It gets verified by a standard, Verra, gold standard. There's a lot of scrutiny, which I'll address in terms of the differentiation of these standards, as well as if they actually can deal with many of the concerns that investors and the media have. It gets listed on a registry. Then you essentially have corporates, investors purchasing them, and you have a system of MRV, measurement, verification, and reporting, which allows you to examine the degree to which the offset is actually producing the carbon that it set out to. So, interestingly enough, the voluntary market and the CDM kind of flipped places in the 2010s. So the CDM will really reach its peak around 2012, and that's when new provisions were implemented that made projects more stringent and financing went way down. And at the same time, actually, corporates started embracing offsets more, buying actually a lot of offsets that were no longer allowed by the CDM. And the growth in the voluntary market has been quite substantial, around 3x essentially between 2010 and 2021. Recently, though, which isn't included here, we have seen a dip, especially 2024, which is yet to be accounted for. There's likely to be a close to 50% drop in at least retired offsets this year, many of which due to the challenges that I'll discuss in a couple slides. So we're kind of right now, this is a very immediate issue. We're kind of in the throes of how can we design contracts and mechanisms to continue to encourage the growth of this market. What's pretty interesting across regulated and voluntary markets is just the differential in projects and the differential in makeup. And the heterogeneity here, we're going to show project types, also show pricing, which is probably one of the biggest limitations to standardized regimes. The California offset registry is almost dominated by nature. 3/4 or close to 3/4 is nature projects. So by that I mean reforestation projects as well as avoidance projects, so preventing the deforestation. Whereas in the CDM had no nature actually. So already we see a difference between different regulatory systems as well as the regulated and voluntary markets. So I'm going to sit on this slide for a while because the crux of the paper is essentially two things: reviewing the limitations, how we see it in practice, and then pushing for increased robustness. So the number one issue, which I call inframarginal offsets, which is another way to phrase additionality, is that you essentially have offsets that don't contribute on their own right to any differential. There are obvious ways that this plays out. If you have a project, The Guardian likes to write about this, that claims to prevent or avoid deforestation, and there is deforestation, obviously there's no additionality, but that's less of my concern. The inframarginal component here is more so if you have a policy in place, like take what we examined, the US IRA, which has a lot of tax credit for DAC. If that project, a DAC project, is fully economically viable through the IRA, also including it as an offset, actually violates additionality. So this project should not, from a pure economic standpoint, exist on a registry. This happens a lot in electricity markets as well, where you have incentives by regional, state governments in order to increase prices for renewables. And in many cases, actually, RECs aren't additional. The second is greenwashing and emissions loopholes. What you have is a tiered market, which we'll go into on kind of pricing, where the upper echelon is much more expensive than the lower echelon. So you do have some nefarious actors, corporates, project developers, that are looking to make a quick buck from it. But again, my concern is probably more towards the violators, the economic mechanisms, because that's where it's more rampant. Again, the Guardian will likely cover most of the second example, the second limitation here. 3, in terms of counterfactual evaluation, there's kind of 2 ways this plays out. The first is what I was kind of insinuating, where you have certain actors that try to manipulate baselines. And because of differential standards, Vera, gold standard, a lot of them call for slightly different protocols in terms of what the baseline year for a project is set. So in order to illustrate this, if you have a reforestation project, what year should you use to form the baseline of the amount of carbon for that land? Is it this year? Is it 5 years ago? There's really not that much agreement on it. And as a result, it's kind of subject to quite a bit of manipulation. On double counting, this is what Estelle talked about quite a bit when you try to merge a voluntary and a compliance market. But double counting exists a lot, even in the voluntary market. So if in an electricity market, for instance, which I mentioned, there's a lot of incentives or policies for utilities to be producing renewable energy. And in many of those cases, they will transfer between them quite a bit of renewable energy credits. And at the same time, some of them will sell it on the market. So you have a kind of a pure play example of double counting right there. And then finally, emissions leakage, which I don't think is talked about enough, I would argue, in the context of voluntary offsets. Kind of 2 examples I'll give where leakage can occur. Coal. You do have quite a bit of offsets that look to prevent or decommission coal plants. But what some studies have found recently is that project may be successful on an idiosyncratic basis, but what it'll do is it'll drive the cost of capital for buying that coal plant or establishing another one down far enough that actually it incentivizes private investors to go in and just set up a new coal plant. So that's kind of an example of perverse or adverse incentives playing out here. Another example of leakage is for a reforestation or an avoidance project. Let's say this occurs quite a bit in West and Central Africa. You have forest on some major resource, be it, and there's a mining operation that would like to ensue. You can push for an offset in order to avoid that and restrict a certain region. But what that'll do, it may save one piece of land, but then incentivizes land that's not covered under that voluntary offset to actually be deforested. So it's very difficult on a macro basis to understand what the impact of a specific project is, even if that project proves additional, not inframarginal, and is kind of under the kind of correct protocol. Permanence is another issue that I kind of lump into that category, which is often talked about, so I won't go into it too much. But with my kind of forestry example, if a firm is buying forestry-based carbon offsets, they're using that day one to account for a net zero commitment, and it's kind of in their internal accounting. 3 years later, the forest burns down. Now what? The kind of biggest limitation from a financial perspective, which is the pricing heterogeneity. So I'll show 2 graphs here, and I'll talk about really, I think, which was a good question about the difference between industrial offsets, nature-based offsets, to show the heterogeneity by type. Even by region, the statistical significance of kind of both these charts is quite large. And you essentially can commit even some degree of geographic arbitrage in buying and selling offsets, which has been done to some degree. The reason for kind of both these charts existing, especially the second one, Vera being the largest regime for nature-based is mainly actually due to the type of offset that's being forbade. So it's not like in Oceania the offsets are just better and project developers are under more strict terms. It more has to do with the type of offset that is being transacted. So if you look at pricing by type, the lowest level, which is kind of the Red Plus, a program for preventing deforestation avoidance, will trade these days anywhere from $2 to $6 per metric ton on average. Your nature-based, your reforestation type offsets will trade slightly over 10, about 12 to 15. Natural gas and a bunch of renewable energy in the 20s to 30s. And then once you go to the higher end, BECCS, bio, energy, carbon capture storage, and just carbon capture and storage will trade well over 100. And then DAC, direct air capture, will trade in the thousands. So what you're seeing here is more a reflection on that than anything else. But what that creates is a difficulty, in my mind, to call a carbon credit a commodity. And this is actually, I think, very directly tied to a question that was asked. And what we challenge in this paper is an offset, or should an offset be a commodity, or should it be a bond? If it's a commodity, it looks very similar to an emissions trading scheme, in which case an offset is an allowance. You essentially swap out one for another. It holds a terminal value, and it could be traded for a fixed, or in some cases, multiple prices based on what we discussed in terms of price heterogeneity. If it's a bond, then the liability exists in the buyer of the contract. So you essentially would pay some premium to acquire the rights to an offset, see the deliverance of the actual carbon, and receive somewhat of an interest payment, considered an ecological interest payment as a result of that. So in one case, really the difference is the seller's bearing the liability. In the other case, the buyer is bearing the liability. And many think that offset should be a commodity. The task force for the integrity of carbon markets has pushed for there to be future spot pricing and contracts in this space. The difficulty and the challenges that I want to stress around it being a commodity are, one, with any commodity, you need a high degree of liquidity, which in the voluntary market does not exist at the moment. And two, in terms of the heterogeneity, you really can't at the moment create a single spot price for a carbon offset. So I actually had a debate with a commodity trader about this in a talk a couple weeks ago, who said, well, if you look at corn has 3 spot prices in terms of a commodity based on the quality of corn. So why can't offsets be the same thing? It has to do with in a commodity sense, that is because the difference in corn is intrinsic value. The difference here, ex post, a metric ton of carbon is a metric ton of carbon. Ex ante, it's the risk that needs to be accounted for here. If you can guarantee that a reforestation project will deliver its stated amount of carbon, in an efficient market, it would trade at the same as direct air capture, because the terminal endpoint is the same. So how do you then get there? And the answer may actually be project insurance or risk transfer. If you can have external actors to this, World Bank, multinational development banks, assume the risk of a lot of these contracts, you actually can get a degree of price convergence. That risk obviously then needs to be accounted for, can be securitized and sold like many risk products or derivative products do. But in talking about forming a commodity, if that's where this market wants to head, you really need a risk transfer mechanism of some sort in order for that to occur. Other mechanisms that have been discussed around this in order to reduce the risk of any single carbon project, you can construct diversified portfolios, in which case you include a handful of types or even form ways to hedge against each other. And then that's kind of the financial instrument approach. And then the whole other side is the technology side. MRV has gone a lot more sophisticated, so especially for nature-based projects, the degree of clarity on regions is quite greater. It also then is conducive to a lot of limitations. So California, for a lot of forestry offsets, had an issue actually around the baseline that was exposed through increased MRV. The system that they set up essentially presumed that for any region, the expected growth rate of trees is the average of a bunch of species in the area. And what they found over time through MRV is that it was wholly inaccurate, because some trees well outpaced the average species growth rate, others did not. So as MRV and verification and quality increase, we expect a lot of limitations, especially around baseline counterfactual, to decrease. And finally, some newer technologies like blockchain are helping to prevent double counting. So if you can tokenize it and have a unique ID, it's a lot easier to present it from showing up on multiple markets or a voluntary and compliance. So finally, just wrapping up, what does this mean for policy, and how can the VCM actually then contribute to changes domestically or globally? In terms of regulatory policy, probably the biggest effect is as a price discovery mechanism for a carbon tax. Now, I know a lot of people may stand up and say, well, shouldn't it be priced purely by the social cost of carbon, which I'm not disagreeing with, but this provides at least a market-tested approach for how carbon as a commodity would be priced on aggregate that can contribute at least to carbon tax. In terms of transparency and quality control, in the US at least, the SEC, which is now still under legal review, has pushed for increased disclosure. Offsets actually plays quite a major role under that, which would require firms that are claiming to use offsets to be completely transparent about all the qualities of offsets. This will contribute actually quite a lot to research. One major issue in this space, especially on an idiosyncratic project basis, is just the lack of data. It's the reason probably most of you have not seen papers that really look at empirical analysis at a project or even a firm purchase level basis in terms of the offset market, and tend to focus more on design questions or kind of macro finance questions. And then finally, CBAM, as it's being kind of continually tested and rethought about in terms of design questions, offsets are expected to play quite a major role there. And again, the mechanism by which it's done is likely to take lessons from the voluntary market. So in sum, many limitations exist in the VCM from kind of both a financial market economics view, but also a technology perspective at the moment. But there's some hope and optimism with some new ideas. I particularly am optimistic around using financial tools and financial devices, risk transfer, in order to incentivize greater participation, and policy is likely to be quite derivative from that. So, thank you.
Thanks, Zach. And I think there really is a nice connection between your overview and the previous one, because it is really the covenants. And I think really an open issue is, because as finance, and I saw Patrick nodding, let's have risk and let's have the public sector, but then they may end up with the bad risk. So really a question between, should we regulate for a minimum standard? But who can do that? With carbon emissions, it's easy because you can check the plants. You check the major pollutant and you have a measurement. So who can measure it? Can an SEC or an ESMA really regulate this market? So this is a big question on minimum standards and who is able to monitor and regulation. And so what if you would choose, if I open the discussion, who would be your ideal institution to get some structure in this market? Where would you look at?
I would put it under something like the securities exchange. I think that most of the challenges here, or where it would be taken most seriously, is in the financial realm. And so in order, because again, I think most of the challenges here are contract design, project finance, and the entities that regulate that and markets, I think, is most.
So you will cover the regulation and to set the minimum standard. Questions?
Hi, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I just wonder what your thoughts are on evolving instruments in the market like transition credits, which are being designed in Singapore for the managed phase out of coal plants, and how they can be integrated into existing carbon markets and also compliance systems. And the government of Singapore has also said that for those buyers of transition credits, they can offset their localized carbon tax through the purchases. So that's like bringing together a voluntary market with a compliance market, well, a compliance scheme. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor and think that should increase. I mean, it's quite similar to Article 6.2. I mean, the first transaction 6.2 was done actually last year. There's only been one to date. I think the two markets can interface and be compliant with each other, like in the example of transition credits. There just needs to be a lot of scrutiny around the pricing for it and how that pricing would fit into localized policy, and whether or not that would shift the underlying economics, which is really a mechanism design question. But on principle, there's no reason why you can't have voluntary credits as long as they're of a high enough scrutiny and again an accepted kind of commodity type price there also existing within regulated schemes.
Thanks. Beatrice?
You know, one thing that keeps amazing me is the amount of attention, negative press that this market keeps getting when it really is still tiny. I mean, just look at the number of tons. Even if, you know, every ton was a ton that was retired, we're talking about 0.5 gigaton out of 40 that we are emitting per year. So it's absolutely out of proportion. Of course, there's a huge potential to scale it. But it's the negative press, I think, is killing it rather than scaling it. But my question was really around the differential prices. I mean, it goes back to the question also of complementary services. So these offsets, if they are cooking stoves, there are health benefits. If you're preserving the Amazon, there are biodiversity co-benefits, and therefore different prices might be the right answer. So, you know, it is different types of corn, even though we are measuring them somehow in a ton, which doesn't make, it should be a ton plus.
Yeah. So on your first comment, I think you're exactly right. I mean, even right now, the voluntary market's valued in terms of market around 2 billion, compliance markets in the hundreds of billions. So just an order of magnitude, it's quite minute. Your second point, it depends, you know, how you envision the market looking. If you want a robust kind of commodity type market that would trade on an exchange, it has to be oriented around tons, and I would actually argue the opposite, that co-benefits or other externalities should be completely omitted in that sense. You know, the question of biodiversity, which comes up quite a bit, I would argue, as one that used to research ecology and biodiversity, it's very hard to pin down an exact kind of objective function around it, whereas in the carbon world, it's a lot easier to just minimize tonnage. So it can be incorporated as a co-benefit into pricing. That's how it's done now, and it's done bilaterally that way. So if you look at especially a bunch of nature-based projects, especially those in the Brazilian Amazon or the Congo Basin, they try to claim quite a bit of a price premium because of the measured biodiversity, you know, saving that comes from that. In a robust market that, again, functions mostly off of kind of commodity, be it if you include risk transfer or are able to kind of normalize for the different technological approaches. I would argue it should probably exist separately and focus just on tonnage.
Can I pick up on that? We as academics have an addiction to climate. And the ones who do impact valuation, like George Serafheim at Harvard and Colin Mayer, and I have colleagues in Amsterdam, Impact Institute, they really distinguish different things like pollution of chemical. So they have many different things like your cooking and other things. So they have very different things and they have different shadow prices for it. So really to have a refined, you can call it ecosystem service, but really to calculate impact in a refined way. So I think your question is very correct that at some point we need to think beyond carbon emissions and look at separate effects, separate impacts of
different markets.
Different markets, and then value them separately, rather than putting everything, consolidate everything in tons of carbon.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more on that. I guess my point is just a financial mechanism point. I think that there is an over-carbonization to quite a bit.
Also research-wise, because we know carbon, but biodiversity is equally important, but still under-researched, and we still have other areas. But then Estelle has a question, but I have also a question to you. So Zachery is saying, I would give it to the SEC in the US. So am I correct that because it is now under MiFID, that was one of the success factors for ETS? So would you confirm that we need a tough regulator for this stuff? And then your question.
Yes, but the problem is that you would need to expand the set of expertise also of ESMA, I think, because I think that for the market infrastructure and the regulation of the transaction, for sure, I would move to
accountants. They have now to do the CSRD, and the big question is: should accountants do it or specialists? Now, accountants should check the annual reports, and they should get more knowledge in. Like we as academics need also to be interdisciplinary.
So it was more of a comment than a question that I had, Zachery. So I think we need to be really careful about the terminology offset and credit. So you use both interchangeably. And I feel like, offset somehow is implicitly saying that it's used for compensation. And we need to think about, provision, nature-based provision, and we need a lot of those. Then a third of the nationally determined contributions are coming from nature, rather than using offset that implicitly says it's used for mitigation necessarily. So I think we need to be really careful about this. There's a lot of confusion in the public too about these.
Good point. Yeah, I agree.
So on the boards I'm on, we're always looking at this question. And so it ties in with the whole morning. So we set objectives. Once we set the objectives, we determine what carbon we can reduce from an operational standpoint and what we can offset or by getting credits. And we have to make decisions on what we can offset, how we pay for it, and whether these are valid. And then after that, what we can't offset, then we make the decision of whether we sell the assets or not, or just get out of the business, which is the whole tied in this morning. The question I have from a business standpoint, for board members who are not researchers on carbon, policy is going to be really important, clarity, and maybe, I think this would be helpful in terms of research, what kind of questions should we be asking, and how do we understand the answers we get? That would apply both to directors, but also to accountants. We have a fiduciary duty. We sign, I'm on an impact fund, we sign the whole process, and we're responsible for that. So I think this would be just tying in between this really important research that we've heard this morning, very, very helpful, and realizing that there are people who have to make decisions on it, those who know what they're talking about, and then people who have to oversee those decisions, and those who need to understand it.
I think it's a great point. When we, I'm putting on my other hat because I kind of sit between the academic and the corporate finance world. When we advise companies on whether or not they should look into offsets, it is by a pretty similar, schematic to what you described, in which you look at the ability to do operational decarbonization. There's obviously limits. It's quite a bit different in the U.S., where primarily operate, and in Europe. But essentially, what you want to be doing is, pricing carbon risk in your ability to either decarbonize now or down the road, and make a business decision based on cost benefit of whether or not it makes sense or not to buy offsets. I mean, even from Lazard's perspective, not as an advisor but as a corporation, we've asked the question: should we buy offsets to be net zero? And while it may seem a little hypocritical or surprising, we decide not to. And actually, I was in favor of that, because our level of especially scope 1 and 2 emissions as a financial services firm is really minimal, and it would be equivalent to kind of just PR and optics in order to do that. It wouldn't have necessarily a very statistically significant environmental benefit. So we decided, based on the cost benefit, that it didn't make a lot of sense. And so I think it's important for corporates to kind of look at the full scope of it, both in terms of understanding limitations and pricing in markets, and how you can not screw yourself in the future in regard to that, but also fit it into a fuller decarbonization plan, which is really the goal here.
Certainly, just to follow up on that, the whole issue that was raised earlier on the schemes themselves, on how valid those schemes are. So that's the insurance risk you're talking about, which we can't price right now. So making a decision on something you can't price means that you're not making a full decision. And I think that's the, the whole, what is it, the dog that bites its tail, or whatever it's called. Yeah.
With new financial instruments that maybe don't exist yet, that could be true.
Final question here.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot for the talk. Very rich and interesting. I found your suggestion to structure as a bond quite intriguing, actually, because ultimately it's a promise, right? You promise to deliver a kind of CO2 offset, but at the moment you promise something, and that promise gets sold without actually checking in whether you deliver on your promise. So, having what you suggested seems kind of also like a way to price that risk, because if you see that people are not delivering on their promises, then you kind of, like in a credit default kind of sense, people don't deliver, and then you price it automatically. You don't even need these kinds of quality high, quality low, because this is just automatically like a bond rating, right? Do you see people moving in that direction at some point, or are there any kind of advocates for this idea at the moment?
Yeah, and I don't think the whole market is moving in that direction, but there definitely is movement, because you have rating agencies that have emerged, B0 being, I think, the largest at the moment, that on a bilateral basis are rating bonds, and they're rating carbon projects, and they're rating them in an analogous form to how bonds are rated. And I think that's the appropriate movement towards more of kind of this bond type buyer liable security that we're discussing. And so I think that this will emerge, and I think the ecosystem is kind of moving around it. But still keep in mind, in terms of transactions, the majority of offsets are transacted bilaterally still. So it's not so much OTC in that you have a massive commodity market to compete with here. It's mainly firms sourcing project developers or themselves. So I think that my view is it'll probably head in one direction, either towards a commodity track, which the Task Force on Integrity for Carbon is kind of advising, or this more kind of bond track. And my view is probably it should look, for the reasons you described, more like the latter, and that the closest analogy to an offset contract, or how it should look, is probably a forward ag contract, because the two are quite similar in terms of risk and deliverance, less so than an ex-ante commodity. But that's kind of just my view.
Thanks. From this space, I can look at the garden, and the good news is I think the lunch is going to get there. And what I see in the garden is a little bit of sun and a little bit of cloud. And I think that's really reflecting this offset market. And normally, after such a session, you have aggregate confusion at a higher level, at least for me, but maybe for more. I learned a lot, so I'm less confused now about these markets. And yes, we need to learn from the science, we need to learn from practice. And I think I like Patrick's point. Let's see where we can agree on and get going on that fast, and let the open point, so the no regret, and gets moving, because we need this market. And so I think we can really be grateful for the two papers, and give a good big applause to the two, because we learned a lot.
Let me thank again the Embassy for hosting us here. I think it's a real privilege. We heard about the history of this place. I think if you're German, you're really, or Polish, you're quite emotional about being here and the symbolism of it all. And, you know, two nations that have made it a sport to invade each other's capitals, humiliate each other in Versailles, railway carriages, and steal each other's quadricas. I mean, that they can get together and try to solve problems now is really, really, really encouraging. So I'd like to close with an encouraging message. Dirk, so thank you all for being here. To your point, ECGI is trying to take up your challenge. We are working, you've seen Auxera is one of our sponsors. We're working with Auxera to create a patrons council that will provide a forum for actually developing such papers, but it will also provide a practical means for doing it, because to do what you're saying needs a bit of resource. And, you know, we are also working with our sponsors, Investor, the Wallenberg Group, with AstraZeneca. BNP has been a sponsor, the European Research Council, Auxera, and of course Imperial College. So and CPR, we're working with these partners in order to to pick up that challenge, because it is important. So thank you very much, and enjoy the lunch.